My name is Sophia, and for as long as I can remember, I lived in the shadow of my younger brother, Daniel. From the outside, our family looked ordinary: two kids, two parents, a small house in a quiet neighborhood, but inside those walls, there was an unspoken hierarchy carved into my life like stone. And I was never at the top of it. "If only you could be more like your brother," my mother used to say with a sigh, the words slicing through me sharper than any punishment. My father wasn't much better. He'd smile with pride when Daniel came home with a B on a math test, yet frown when I brought home an A in literature. "That's nice," he'd say dismissively. "But it's not going to get you anywhere." To them, Daniel was the golden child. He was the boy who could do no wrong, the one who hit the winning shot in his high school basketball game, the one who charmed neighbors with his easy smile, the one who was destined, according to my parents, for greatness. And me? I was the one who needed to try harder. The one who, no matter what I did, would never quite measure up. If you've ever been compared to someone in your own family, always made to feel less than, I know exactly how it feels. Drop where you're watching from in the comments and hit subscribe, because trust me, you'll want to hear how this story ends. The comparisons started small. When I was 9, I remember bringing home a drawing I had worked on for days, a watercolor of our backyard with the oak tree that Daniel and I used to climb. I showed it proudly to my mom. She smiled for a second, then said, "That's nice, honey. But look at Daniel. He built a whole Lego castle all by himself." My drawing was set aside, forgotten, while Daniel's castle was displayed in the living room for weeks. As we grew older, those moments multiplied. Daniel played soccer. Suddenly, every family conversation revolved around practices, goals scored, and future scholarships. Meanwhile, my achievements: winning the school's spelling bee, getting my essays published in the local newspaper, were brushed off as cute or just hobbies. It didn't matter that teachers praised me, that friends admired me. At home, the narrative was fixed: Daniel was exceptional, and I was average. By the time I reached high school, the comparisons had become suffocating. At dinner, my father would ask Daniel about his day in detail, nodding with pride at even the smallest success. When it was my turn, he'd listen half-heartedly, then pivot the conversation back to my brother. "That's fine, Sophia," he'd say. "But Daniel's got a big game this week. We should all be there to cheer him on." Even my extended family bought into it. At reunions, aunts and uncles would pat Daniel on the back, ask about his future plans, and brag about him to anyone who would listen. To me, they'd offer a polite smile and a vague, "And how are you doing, dear?" as though I were an afterthought. Inside, I began to crumble. Every time I heard, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" it carved a wound I couldn't heal. I started believing them. Maybe I really wasn't enough. Maybe my dreams were smaller, weaker, unworthy. I stopped sharing my successes. When I won a writing competition, I didn't even tell my parents. I tucked the certificate in a drawer and let the moment fade, because I knew they wouldn't care. Still, a part of me fought quietly against the weight of their words. I studied harder than anyone I knew. I pushed myself in ways Daniel never did, driven not by encouragement but by defiance. If they weren't going to notice me, then I'd make sure the world did. But the cost was high. I lived with constant anxiety, panic attacks before every presentation, and a voice in my head whispering, "You're not good enough. You'll never be as good as him." I remember one night vividly. I was 16, working late on a science project that had taken me weeks to perfect. My presentation board was filled with meticulous notes, diagrams, and data. I brought it to the kitchen, eager to show my dad. He glanced at it for 2 seconds before saying, "That's good, Sophia. But did you hear? Daniel scored the winning goal at today's game. The coach says he might have a shot at varsity next year." I nodded, forcing a smile, while my heart sank. I had poured everything into that project, and in a single sentence, it was reduced to nothing. I carried that moment like a scar, a reminder that in my family's eyes, I would never be enough. Looking back, I see how those years shaped me. They planted insecurities so deep that even when I achieved something remarkable, I doubted myself. I questioned whether I deserved it, whether it was worth anything without their validation. But they also lit a fire inside me, a fire that refused to die no matter how much they tried to smother it with comparisons. And that fire would carry me further than I ever imagined. Because here's the truth, Daniel's charm and my parents' favoritism could only carry him so far. Life has a way of revealing who we really are, and while they kept telling me I'd never measure up, I was quietly building a strength they couldn't see. A strength they would one day envy. At the time, though, I didn't know any of this. At 16, all I knew was that I was tired of fighting for scraps of recognition, tired of hearing my brother praised for doing the bare minimum while I broke myself chasing perfection. I thought the only way forward was to work harder, to try to finally win their approval. I couldn't have been more wrong. The moment I stopped chasing their validation was the moment my life began to change. But to get there, I had to endure the breaking point, the moment when their words would finally push me past the edge of trying. And when that moment came, it would set me free in ways none of us could have imagined. By the time I graduated high school, I had mastered the art of pretending. On the outside, I was the hardworking, quiet girl who always seemed composed. On the inside, I was drowning in the weight of never being enough. Every compliment I received from teachers or friends echoed hollow in my chest because I knew, deep down, that the people who mattered most to me would never see it the same way. College was supposed to be my fresh start. I had worked tirelessly to earn a scholarship, pulling late nights and sacrificing weekends while Daniel breezed through senior year with average grades and constant praise for his natural talent. I remember packing my bags for university, hoping that once I left home, the comparisons would fade. But the truth is, you carry the voices of your childhood with you, even when you think you've escaped. At orientation, I felt like an imposter. Other students laughed easily, already forming groups, while I hung back, afraid to insert myself. I had learned from years at home that speaking up often meant being shut down or overshadowed. That self-doubt clung to me like a second skin. Even in classes where I excelled, I heard my father's voice. "That's nice, Sophia, but it's not practical." So, I worked harder than everyone else. Not because I believed in myself, but because I was terrified of confirming my parents' belief that I was less. While Daniel partied through his college years funded, of course, by endless parental support, I juggled a part-time job and a full course load. I lived off ramen and black coffee, pulling 12-hour study sessions to make sure I stayed at the top of my class. Every time I aced an exam, I felt a flicker of pride, followed immediately by guilt. What did it matter if no one at home cared? I'll never forget one Thanksgiving during my sophomore year. I had just been offered an internship at a prestigious marketing firm. Competitive, high-paying, the kind of opportunity that could change everything. Excited, I shared the news at the dinner table. My mom smiled politely, but within seconds she turned to Daniel. "Did you tell them about your coaching job, honey? Isn't that wonderful? He's so good with the kids." And just like that, my moment was gone. Everyone clapped for him, while I sat quietly, my big news swallowed whole. I left that dinner early, blaming homework, but really, I just couldn't stand the hollow ache in my chest. That night, back in my tiny dorm room, I stared at my internship offer letter and wondered if maybe I was chasing the wrong thing all along. But then something inside me hardened. I was tired of living as though their opinion was the only one that mattered. Tired of breaking myself for applause that would never come. If they couldn't see my worth, then maybe I had to build a life so big, so undeniable, that their silence wouldn't matter anymore. The struggle wasn't just at home, it was inside me too. Even as I excelled academically, I carried that childhood weight of not being good enough. Every compliment from professors felt undeserved. Every opportunity came with a whisper in my mind, "Daniel would have done this better." When I landed another internship the following summer, I worked twice as hard as anyone else, staying late at the office long after the lights had dimmed. My supervisors praised me for my work ethic, but they didn't see the cost, panic attacks in the bathroom stall, migraines from lack of sleep, nights crying quietly into my pillow. The insecurities followed me into friendships, too. I struggled to believe people genuinely liked me. If they laughed at my jokes or complimented my work, I brushed it off, convinced they were just being polite. Dating was even harder. I pushed people away before they had the chance to leave, because deep down, I believed no one could ever truly choose me over someone else. Meanwhile, Daniel thrived, or so it seemed. Our parents never missed an opportunity to brag about him. He landed an average job at a local firm, but to hear them tell it, he was the next CEO in the making. He bought a used car, and they praised him for his financial responsibility. He coached a neighborhood soccer team, and suddenly he was a community hero. Each time I called home, I was met with updates about Daniel's latest accomplishment, while my achievements were acknowledged with a brief, "That's nice, dear." The contrast was suffocating. I was climbing a mountain, scraping my hands bloody against the rocks, while Daniel was carried up the hill on a golden chariot. And still, I kept going. Because here's the thing, trauma leaves scars, but it can also leave fuel. Every cutting word, every dismissal, every comparison, they lit a fire inside me I couldn't extinguish. I didn't just want to succeed. I needed to. I needed to prove, maybe not to them, but to myself, that I was more than the shadow they had shoved me into. After college, I landed my first full-time role at a major firm in the city. It was brutal, long hours, high stakes, bosses who demanded perfection, but I threw myself into it with everything I had. I knew how to survive on little sleep, how to grind until my eyes blurred, how to push past the voice in my head telling me I wasn't enough. Each promotion I earned was a small rebellion, a quiet scream against the years of being told I would never measure up. But the insecurities never vanished. I would stand in boardrooms, presenting strategies that executives praised, and still hear my father's voice in the back of my mind, "Daniel is the one with real potential." I would walk home through the city streets, clutching my paycheck, and still wonder if my parents would ever be proud of me. The struggle wasn't just external. It was a war inside me, one I wasn't sure I would ever win. But with every small victory, with every step forward, I felt something shifting. I was beginning to realize that maybe the validation I was chasing wasn't theirs to give. And one day, I would stop chasing it altogether. What I didn't know then was that the breaking point was still to come, the moment when my parents would dismiss me one final time, and I would decide, once and for all, that I was done trying to earn a love that had always been conditional. That moment would change everything, not just for me, but for them too. Because when the child you've spent your life belittling finally decides to walk away, you can only watch from the bottom as she rises to the top. The breaking point came on an ordinary Sunday. Isn't that how it always happens? Not in the middle of some dramatic fight, not during some obvious moment of crisis, but on a quiet day, when you least expect it. I was 25 then, working as a junior executive at a corporate firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous yet, but it was the kind of position that people spent years trying to get. I was already overseeing a small team, traveling for meetings, sitting in rooms with people I had once only read about in business journals. It was exhausting but exhilarating, and for the first time in my life, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was building something of my own. That Sunday, I drove back to my parents' house for dinner. I hadn't been home in weeks, buried under deadlines and projects. Part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, they'd notice my absence, ask about my work, or show a flicker of pride. But as soon as I walked in, I could tell the story of the night had already been chosen, and it wasn't mine. Daniel was there, of course, sitting at the head of the table like he owned the place. He had just been promoted to assistant coach for his old high school's soccer team, and my parents were treating it as though he had been elected president. Isn't it amazing? My mom gushed as she set a platter of roasted chicken on the table. Your brother is shaping young lives now. He's going to be such a positive influence on those boys. I forced a smile, sliding into my seat. That's great, Daniel. Congrats. He shrugged modestly, but the smirk tugging at his lips told me he was basking in the attention. Thanks. It's not a big deal, really. Oh, don't be humble, my dad said, clapping him on the back. It's leadership. It's real responsibility. You're building something that matters. The words hit me like a slap. Real responsibility. Building something that matters. Wasn't I doing that too? I wanted to say it out loud, to remind them that I was running projects worth millions of dollars, that I was making decisions every day that affected more people than Daniel ever would on a soccer field. But I knew how it would go. They would nod politely, then pivot the spotlight back to him. Dinner dragged on, filled with stories about Daniel's players, Daniel's ideas, Daniel's potential. I sat quietly, my fork scraping against my plate, heat rising in my chest. I told myself not to expect anything different, but the truth is, a small part of me had still hoped. Hoped for one question, just one, about my work, my life, my struggles. But it never came. The moment that broke me happened after dessert. I had stepped into the living room to grab my bag when I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. My mother's voice was soft, but clear enough. "Thank God for Daniel," she said. "At least we know one of our children will make something of himself." I froze. My father chuckled. "Yes, Sophia's doing fine, but let's be honest, it's Daniel who'll carry the family legacy. She'll never be quite like him." The words sliced through me, sharper than anything they had ever said to my face. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the finality of it. The way they spoke as though my path had already been decided, as though no matter what I achieved, I would always be second best. I stood there, rooted to the floor, my breath caught in my throat. They had no idea I could hear them. To them, it was just the truth spoken casually over dishes. To me, it was the death of something I had been holding onto, the belief that someday, if I worked hard enough, they would finally see me. I walked back into the kitchen, my hands trembling but my voice steady. "I think I'll head out now," I said. My mom smiled, oblivious. "So soon?" "We were just about to have coffee." "I've got work to do," I replied, forcing a calm I didn't feel. My father nodded, already turning back to Daniel, already forgetting me. I drove home that night with tears blurring my vision, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My whole life had been a battle for their approval, and in a single overheard conversation, I realized it was a war I could never win. They weren't waiting to be convinced. They had already decided who I was and who I wasn't. For days afterward, I replayed those words in my head. She'll never be quite like him. Each repetition stung, but slowly, something inside me shifted. If their approval was impossible, then maybe I didn't need it anymore. Maybe my worth had never belonged in their hands to begin with. That was the breaking point. The moment I stopped chasing their validation and started chasing something else, something bigger. Not long after, I poured myself into work with a new kind of fury. I stayed later, volunteered for the hardest projects, and made connections that would propel me further than I had dared dream. But this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. The trauma of being overlooked didn't vanish overnight. The insecurity still whispered in my ear, reminding me of every dismissal, every comparison. But beneath the doubt was a new determination. A vow that if my parents would never see my worth, then the world damn well would. And as I pushed forward, I began to realize something my parents never could. The ones who underestimate you give you the greatest fuel. What I didn't know then was just how far that fuel would take me. After that Sunday, something in me snapped into place. I stopped waiting for their validation and redirected that hunger into something I could control: my career, my independence, my future. For the first time, my energy wasn't being spent trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I wasn't enough. It was being spent on building a life that would make their opinion irrelevant. The change wasn't immediate, but it was powerful. At work, I stopped holding back. I had always been the quiet one in meetings, afraid to speak up in case I stumbled. Now, I forced myself to raise my voice. I volunteered for the high-risk accounts that others avoided. I pulled late nights not because I was desperate for praise, but because I wanted mastery. Slowly, people began to notice. Executives remembered my name. Colleagues started coming to me for advice. Within 2 years, I was promoted twice. By 27, I was leading a department most people didn't reach until their mid-30s. The money was better, but it was the respect that mattered more. For the first time, I walked into rooms and knew I belonged there. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family had grown more distant. Calls became fewer, visits rare. When I did see them, the conversations never changed. Daniel was still the shining star, despite his life looking far less golden up close. His coaching job paid little, and though he bragged about opportunities, he was still living off my parents' generosity. They covered his rent when he fell behind, bought him a new car when his broke down, and even helped with credit card debt he had racked up. But to hear them talk, you'd think he was conquering the world. Daniel's got such potential, my father would say. He's just waiting for the right opportunity. I'd bite my tongue, resisting the urge to mention that while Daniel was waiting, I was out there making opportunities happen. I remember one Christmas in particular. I had just closed a deal worth millions for the firm, a deal that earned me recognition from the CEO himself. Am is playing next month. The old me would have shrunk into silence, hurt gnawing at me like a slow burn. But this time, I just nodded and let it pass. Because here's what I was starting to realize. Their blindness wasn't my burden anymore. Their refusal to see my worth didn't erase it. The higher I climbed, the less I needed their applause. My worth was reflected back at me in the respect of my peers, in the steady growth of my bank account, in the quiet pride I felt each time I signed my name on a project that would outlast me. By the time I hit 30, I had bought my own condo overlooking the city skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows, sleek furniture, a view that stretched for miles. I remember standing there one evening, glass of wine in hand, watching the lights flicker on across the city. For the first time in my life, I felt untouchable. Of course, my parents visited once. They walked through the condo like tourists, commenting on the size, the view, the furniture. But instead of pride, I saw something else in their eyes, hesitation. Maybe even discomfort. "It's impressive," my father said finally, though his voice carried a stiffness that told me he didn't quite know what to make of it. Daniel, on the other hand, scoffed. "Nice place, sophomore. But money isn't everything, you know. At least I'm doing something meaningful." I didn't even argue. I just smiled, poured myself another glass of wine, and let the silence hang between us. Because deep down I knew the truth, they were watching me rise higher than they ever thought possible, and it terrified them. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was slowly unraveling. The golden boy who was supposed to carry the family legacy was stumbling under the weight of his own choices. His coaching contract wasn't renewed after too many late practices and missed responsibilities. He bounced between part-time jobs, none of which stuck. His debts piled up, and my parents' savings began to drain as they bailed him out again and again. I didn't gloat. At least, not out loud. But there was a part of me that found grim satisfaction in the irony. The daughter who had been dismissed, overlooked, and belittled was soaring, while the son they had placed on a pedestal was sinking. Still, they couldn't say it out loud. They couldn't admit they had been wrong. At family gatherings, they continued to praise Daniel's resilience, while my achievements were met with strained smiles. But I no longer craved their recognition. Because I had something better: freedom. Freedom from their comparisons. Freedom from their judgment. Freedom from the weight of being invisible in my own family. I built a circle of people who saw me clearly, friends who celebrated my victories without jealousy, mentors who guided me without condescension, colleagues who respected me without hesitation. With them, I didn't have to fight to be seen. I simply was. One night, after a long day at the office, I got a call from my mother. Her voice trembled in a way I hadn't heard before. "Sophia, can you come by? We need to talk." When I arrived, the truth spilled out. My parents were in financial trouble. Years of covering Daniel's debts had caught up to them. Their savings were nearly gone, their retirement at risk. They needed help. The old me would have rushed in, desperate to finally earn their approval by saving the day. But this version of me, the one who had clawed her way to the top without their support, just sat there, listening. "Please, Sophia," my father said, his voice breaking. You're the only one who can help us now. It was almost laughable. After years of being told I would never measure up, here they were, looking at me as though I was the only hope left. And in that moment, I realized I had won a victory far greater than any title or paycheck could give me, because I no longer needed them. I sat across from them in the same living room where I had once overheard their whispered dismissal years before. My mother wrung her hands, my father stared at the floor, and Daniel slouched on the couch with the same arrogance he'd carried all his life. The air was heavy with something I had never seen in them before: desperation. "Please, Sophia," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We just need a little help to get back on our feet. Daniel's had some setbacks, and your father's retirement isn't what we thought it would be. You've done so well for yourself. Surely you can spare something." Her words might have pierced me once. They might have woken that old hunger, that aching desire to finally be seen as worthy. But now, sitting there with years of scars stitched into strength, I felt nothing but clarity. "I've done well for myself," I repeated softly. "And I did it without your help. I did it while being told over and over that I would never measure up." My father shifted uncomfortably. "Sophia, we didn't mean." "Yes, you did," I cut in. "You meant every word. And you know what? You were right about one thing. I'll never be like Daniel." Daniel looked up then, his smirk faltering. "I'll never be like him because I built something real. I learned to stand on my own 2 feet while you carried him like a child. And now you want me to fix the mess you made." The silence was suffocating. My mother's eyes welled with tears, my father's jaw tightened, and Daniel muttered something under his breath about family loyalty. I stood. Family loyalty is a two-way street. And all my life, I've been driving it alone. I won't do it anymore. For the first time, they didn't know how to respond. The daughter they had underestimated, ignored, dismissed, she wasn't asking for their approval anymore. She wasn't begging to be let in. She was walking out. I left their house that night without looking back. The cold air bit at my face, but it felt cleansing, like stepping into a new world. My phone buzzed with texts over the next few weeks, pleas from my mother, guilt-laced messages from my father, even a half-hearted attempt from Daniel to talk things out. But I didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. I had already given them more than they deserved. Years of trying. Years of believing that if I worked hard enough, if I shone bright enough, they'd finally see me. But their blindness wasn't mine to fix. Instead, I poured myself into the life I had built. I expanded my career, invested wisely, traveled to places I had once only dreamed of. I surrounded myself with people who didn't measure my worth against someone else's shadow. Friends who cheered when I succeeded, mentors who pushed me to grow, colleagues who respected me without condition. And slowly, the hole my family had carved into me began to fill, not with their approval, but with my own. Years later, I heard through distant relatives that my parents had sold their house to cover debts, that Daniel had drifted from one failed venture to another, always waiting for someone else to save him. They had finally realized that the pedestal they'd placed him on was built on sand. By then, I was long gone. Not just from their lives, but from the need that had once tethered me to them. I had climbed higher than they ever imagined, not in spite of their doubts, but because of them. Every dismissal, every comparison, every cruel word had become fuel. And now, from the top of the mountain I had scaled alone, I could finally look down and see it clearly. They were still trapped in the same old cycle. And me? I was free. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. It isn't about shouting or proving or even punishing. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is silence. It's walking away so far, so high, that when they finally look up to see you, all they can do is wish. Wish they had believed in you. Wish they had treated you better. Wish they had known who you were before you were gone. But by then, it's too late. If you've ever been told you weren't good enough, let this story remind you that silence can be the loudest revenge. Drop a comment sharing where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your story. Hit that like button if this touched you, and don't forget to subscribe to Classic Revenge so you never miss the next twist in our true family revenge stories. Because sometimes, the best way to win is to walk away.